Nurses, what haunting confessions have you heard in a patient's final moments that you still can't forget? Story 1. When I was in school, I was shadowing an ICU nurse, and we were taking care of an elderly woman dying of brain cancer. One day, when her family went home for the night, and we were getting her ready for bed, she randomly blurts out, "Should I tell him they said or not his?" She was referring to her children and husband, who had just left. She elaborated and told us that their two children are both from different men, and not just any man's, but her husband's childhood best friend. What made this even crazier was that her children were probably 50 years old. I have no idea how this had stayed a secret for so long. Fast forward to the next morning, and I see an unfamiliar older gentleman in her room. Before I say anything to anyone, the nurse I was shadowing whispered to me that that was the childhood best friend. I don't know whether or not they were still messing around, but I don't think I have ever seen a secret 50-year-old love triangle. We told her that she should not tell her husband and children. If it's been a secret this long, there's no point in telling them on your deathbed, but were we right for that? Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button, and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I've been a nurse for 6 years. A year or two before I started, my floor housed a convicted child SIer, sent to us from prison, dying of cancer. One of my coworkers told me about how the patient described his child victims hovering outside the windows, waiting for him to leave his body so they could see him get what he deserved. We were on the 10th floor at that time. I asked my coworker if he thought the children were hallucinations. He's one of the smartest, most perceptive people I know. He said he thought there was a good chance that what that patient saw was real. Also, had an elderly woman who had gone downhill and was on her deathbed for about a week. She kept asking me to read the Bible to her, and as soon as I would start, she would scream that he was coming to get her, that he was waiting right behind me. It was very unnerving at 3 a.m. Finally, I asked her who was coming to get her, and she replied with, "The devil's coming for me because I let my husband SA our kids and I did nothing." Story 3. A giant former NFL player patient in the geriatric unit of a local hospital a few years ago displayed late-stage dementia symptoms, possibly CTE-related, as he was only in his mid-60s. He permitted me to attend to his needs but shunned every other staff member from his room, including his physician. He threw his food and anything within reach at other staff, so everybody else was scared to go into his room. He also charged at them like a linebacker if they didn't immediately leave his room. I was scared of him, but the first time I was assigned to him, I spoke to him in an abnormally out-of-character for me tone, cold, mean, sarcastic, which for some reason he took to. One day, weeks later, about 4:30 p.m., I was assisting him into his bed from his chair. I asked, "Oh, you're already ready for bed? What, you threw too much food today? No wonder you're so tired. Perhaps tomorrow will be different." He was abnormally calm and collected, and later learned he hadn't yelled at or thrown anything at other staff over the entire day. Upon getting him onto the bed, he grabbed my hand and said, "Tell everyone I'm sorry and thank you for putting up with me." Seconds later, he took his last breath, still sitting up on the bed. He sadly had no visitors during his multiple hospital stays over the previous few weeks, but later that night, other staff found a photo of his late wife in his belongings, who looked very similar to me. Story 4. I've been a medic for 22 years, and before that I spent 5 years as an EMT. I've worked so many codes that I've forgotten half of them, but there's one I will never forget. It was 1999. I'd been a medic for about 2 years and was working a 24-hour shift at a County 911 squad. The tones dropped Medic 129 for the 2nd ambulance, Medic 122 to cover 123, Main Street for an unknown type problem. The next town's ambulance was already on a run, so we were next on the box card. We rushed to the truck, fired up the diesel engine, and hit the road. Since both my partner and I were medics, we'd switch off calls, so one of us wouldn't be stuck doing all the paperwork. Despite what anyone says, medics hate writing charts. So, it took us about 13 minutes to get on scene because of the distance. Medic 122, County, we set are on scene. Copy Medic 122, 1730. Be advised, PD is with Medic 129 and unavailable at this time. Police usually responded with us, not necessarily for safety, but because EMS calls broke up the monotony of their day. I jumped out, opened the ambulance's side door, and grabbed my first in and oxygen bags. My partner grabbed the LifePak 10 heart monitor. A tiny elderly woman, probably around 90, opened the door and greeted us. She spoke softly and said, "My daughter is in the bedroom. She hasn't felt right most of the day. She's in there." She pointed to the last door on the right. The hallway was so narrow, there was no way we could get a stretcher back there. I headed into the bedroom. Her daughter, probably in her 70s, was lying on a couch in a low semi-Fowler's position. My partner stayed in the living room with the mother to gather medical history. As I stepped into the room, the patient turned her head slightly and smiled at me. I did a quick visual scan. Nothing seemed out of place. She had no visible injuries and was clearly aware of my presence. Then came the moment I'll never forget. I knelt beside her, reached to touch her hand, partly to comfort her, partly to check her pulse. I was about 10 inches away when I said, "Hi, my name is Bill, I'm the medic, and I'm going to take care of you." She smiled at me, and then it happened. From the right corner of her lips, where the top and bottom lip meet, a stream of blood began pouring straight down her face onto the couch. It wasn't a trickle. It was a stream. If I had a Slurpee-sized cup, it would have filled in 2 minutes. I looked back into her eyes. She was still looking at me, but it felt like she was looking through me. No pulse, no respirations, nothing. She'd coded right there in front of me. I started yelling, "Carl, go get the Reeves." She just coded. I pulled over the LifePak 10 and grabbed the combo pads. 5 seconds later, I heard the front door slam open as my partner sprinted to the truck for the carry sheet. He came flying back in. "What happened?" I told him quickly while I started CPR and pulled out my IV and intubation kits. Back then, we didn't stay and play as we do more now. Our scene times were expected to be under 20 minutes. If you stayed longer, you needed a very good reason, or expected to be called in by the medical command doctor. Thankfully, that protocol has evolved. Now we know that good quality CPR creates vascular pressure to help medications circulate, and that defibrillation, when indicated, is the key from the start. In most cases, hospitals didn't do much more than what we were already doing in the field. I intubated her and placed a 16 G IV in her right antecubital fossa. Her initial rhythm was a systole flatline. So, no defibrillation. I gave 1 milligram of 1/10,000 epinephrine and followed with 1 milligram of atropine, our protocol at the time. The max was 3 milligrams of atropine in a systole. These days, it's just epinephrine unless you consult medical control for anything else. We got her onto the Reeves, out to the stretcher, loaded her in the ambulance, and sped toward the ER. I called in for a med patch, a secure channel to the ER, not picked up on public scanners, and gave my report. The ER replied, "Okay, awaiting your arrival." At the ER, the back doors opened to 2 RNs and the attending physician. One nurse took one look at me and said, "Bill, are you okay? You look like you were caught in a tornado and struck by lightning at the same time." My partner took the stretcher out while I followed with the monitor. One RN hopped on the stretcher, straddled the patient, and continued CPR as we rushed into the resuscitation bay. I walked alongside the attending, giving him a full rundown. We transferred her to the ER bed, and my partner took the gear out for decontamination. The ER team continued efforts to revive her. I stepped out, spotted the receptionist walking the patient's mother to the family room. I asked if anyone had spoken to her yet. She said no. I grabbed a towel, tried to make myself presentable, and walked into the family room. The mother was sitting alone. I sat beside her, took her soft hand in mine, and looked into her eyes. I told her that both my partner and the ER team were doing everything possible. Through tears, she said her daughter was the only family she had left. Her husband of 73 years had passed the previous year. Her sisters were gone. Her daughter, her only child, had never married or had children. She gripped my hand, and though her grip was soft, I felt the weight of her sorrow. Then she said something I'll never forget. "I know we all must go sooner or later, but she's all I have. Since she was little, she was always afraid of being alone. Can you go in there and stay with her? You were the last person she looked at before this happened." I nodded and walked to the resuscitation bay. As I entered, I heard the doctor ask if anyone had any last suggestions before calling it. Before they stopped CPR, I pulled up a metal chair, sat down beside her, and took the hand I hadn't used for the IV. I gently rubbed the back of her hand with my other hand. The doctor gave me a puzzled look. I told him I'd explain later. The code was called. The nurse assigned for post-mortem care went to gather supplies. I stayed beside her, holding her hand for 5 more minutes. Then the double doors opened, and it was her mother. I'd expected a nurse. But no, it was the mother, coming to be with her daughter. I gently placed her daughter's hand back by her side. The mother walked over and gave me the kind of hug you only get from someone who hasn't seen a loved one in years. The kind that says, "Please, don't let go." Tears streamed down my face. I stepped back to give her space. No matter how old your child is, you always see them as your baby. As I walked out, the attending placed a hand on my shoulder. "Bill," he said, "you did everything in your power to hold off the angel of death. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't. But from what you told me, she had 2 excellent medics by her side, with every tool available. No one could ask for more when tragedy strikes." He meant well. But I couldn't shake the memory of her eyes, so full of life just moments before. I thought about all the joy, grief, and love those eyes had seen. Most calls blur together after a while, but this one feels like it happened yesterday. Story 5. One of the most challenging moments I had with a patient who was passing was a woman in her 80s with advanced dementia and trying to recover from a severe bed sore that had gone septic, which was from a nursing home with a bad reputation. She often confused me with her second husband. Her daughter told me I looked a lot like him. The patient would often talk about our intimate exploits, including swinging and partner swapping as well as very wild adventures. I had given up on trying to tell her I was not her husband because I just confused her and upset her, so I learned to just play along. She talked to me often about our children and other family and many other exciting adventures they had. It made her happy to talk about it and often left me with a smile. My mom and I also look very similar. The only difference is our hair color. She's got black hair and I'm blonde. But when she was my age, she bleached her hair. So functionally, I just look like my mother in her 20s. When my grandfather went downhill in his last year and his Alzheimer's got worse, to the point where he didn't know a lot of people, but he could recognize me, not as his grandchild, but as his 20-something-year-old daughter. I played along and got a lot of stories out of him. They're fun memories, but they hurt all the same. When my grandpa started to go, he obviously started by forgetting my siblings and me because we were the most recent additions. So whenever my dad would talk to him, he'd ask if he wanted to talk to one of us, and my grandpa would ask who we were. "They, sir, your grandkids, Dad." "I have grandkids? That's great. How old are they?" It hurt a little that he didn't remember us, but I tried to remember how excited he was that he had grandkids. Story 6. I'm a scrub nurse. My job is to assist the surgeon during surgeries. I was preparing an elderly patient for a pretty high-risk surgery. There was a good chance he would be fine, but there was also a decent chance that things would go south. He knew this. While the CRNA is doing her thing, getting the anesthesia ready, I'm standing next to him, going over his chart and signed releases, and he says to me, "I need you to tell my wife I'm sorry for all the times I raised my voice at her. There weren't many times. But right now I wish there weren't any." That was the first time I ever got choked up at the bedside. Story 7. I'm an RN, male and white, and I worked with many elderlies. I had an around 90-year-old male talk about how he had been a part of the KKK in his youth, and how ashamed he was of taking part in several lynching and other mistreatment on blacks and even some white Catholics. He'd had several CNAs and patient care techs who were either black or Hispanic, and he was always so polite and sometimes even loving towards them. I could tell how deeply his past haunted him. He asked me not to share this information with any of the staff. The last days before he became too weak to speak anymore, he asked one of the black RNs I worked with if she forgave him. She did not know what he was asking forgiveness for, but told him she did and helped him get right with Jesus. He passed peacefully a couple of days later. I also had a woman who was around 100 tell me she had been badly SA'd by her first husband, but was stuck in the marriage because of the culture at that time. He'd been thrown from a horse that he'd also been very cruel to and kicked several times. She ignored his cries for help and let him pass away. She said she had never told anyone about it, but she felt guilty for it for over 80 years and could still hear him screaming for help. We talked about it for a long time since I was working night shift, and it gave me a chance to spend extra time with some patients. My experience working with people with PTSD helped me to help her see that she was acting to protect herself and others from him, and responding from a place of natural fear. Before she passed, she told me I had helped her find peace with it. My faith and my own life experience have taught me that people do things in the moment because it is often what they believe they have to do, and not to judge them but to help them find peace within themselves. Story 8. This was a couple of years back when I was doing a night shift rotation. Maybe not quite the confession, but it still breaks my heart to this day. Had a patient one night, perfectly fine, came back the next night, and found out they had a massive stroke mid-morning. The family had decided against surgery due to age factors and other things. Wife was telling me they had a good life together. About 40, maybe 50 years of being married. Kept vigil at the bedside all night, holding their hand. All the kids and grandkids were there too. I told them that although the patient was unconscious, they could still hear, so I encouraged the family to keep talking to them. Tell them everything they want to say before it's too late. Around 4 a.m. I could tell the patient was close to the end as their breathing changed, and the wife asked me if it was time. I gave her an honest answer, and she became hysterical, clutching the patient's hand. She kept crying that she wasn't ready to say goodbye. She had so many other plans for them to live out, that she didn't want them to leave this world. She wanted him to continue living. She wished she hadn't withdrawn treatment, so they could have more time together. The patient passed away 15 minutes later. It's been years, but that still stands out to me as one of the most heartbreaking deathbed moments. The next one is when my dad had a severe stroke last year, and the doctor told us that he would never regain consciousness. My parents had a private conversation with each other, saying that if they were rendered catatonic with no hope of recovery, they wouldn't want his life to be artificially extended. My dad was kept on the ventilator for a total of 2.5 weeks. My mom knew what decision she had to make, but she managed to work it out off for an additional 3-4 days. She knew what to do but kept wanting to hold on to my dad. Watching my dad physically worsen over time was utterly heart-wrenching, and in the end we didn't want him to suffer anymore, despite having difficulty letting go. We finally took my dad off the ventilator, and we held his hands and talked to him during his last moments. The thing about death is that there will never be a time when you feel that a person has lived enough. My granddad was also very serious. He was done. He'd finished. You get so old that your body doesn't let you do what you love anymore. And most or all of your friends are dead. Even food starts to lose its taste. Every hobby he loved was stolen from him by age, and all he had left was his dog and his family. His dog was pretty old, and while he loved his family, he was just done. He would have stuck around longer if he hadn't gotten so sick, but he was tired of trying so hard just to feel like crap. We all said goodbye. He pretty much starved to death, but was high as a kite on some powder when he went. He did so much when he was alive. Painted, sung, wrote, directed plays, traveled the world, learned to play every instrument he could get his hands on, fell in love, helped rehabilitate nature, helped save an endangered species, had a nice family, had a good career, built a home. He watched computers come into existence and learned how to program music on them and loved playing games on them too. And when he couldn't do those things anymore, he said goodbye, and that was that. Went through his things when he expired. He wrote some filthy poetry, accompanied by some hilarious sketches. If I'm 1/10 the man he was, I will die happy. Story 9. I recently cared for a woman who had multiple acute strokes in a short amount of time. A week before, she had been independent, riding her horse every day, still teaching part-time at the local school, despite being in her 80s. By the time she got to me, she was completely nonverbal, incontinent, and unable to feed herself. I had a feeling that she was neurologically intact enough to understand what was going on, so I talked to her as much as I could when I was in the room. I talked to her about her daughters who had called every day, her husband who hadn't called, but I left that part out, the weather, her horses, and her students who had sent a card. On the last day of my work week, her daughter from out of state had finally found a flight up. They sat in silence and held hands for hours. Visiting hours ended right at shift change, so I walked in to give her report as the daughter was saying goodbye. The patient then spoke what I knew were going to be her last words. "I'll always be looking after you," and pointed to her daughter, and then at me, and then she fell asleep. 2 days later, when I came back to work, I was informed she had passed away in the night. Story 10. Doctor here, working in the Deep South. And I've heard a lot of patients regret disowning their gay lesbian children and the relationship they could have had. I have seen so many of my patients regretting not talking to their children after they came out on their deathbed. Unfortunately, rigid religious political dogma tears apart more families than most people realize. Life is short. Accept people, especially the ones you love, for who they are and not who you would like them to be. Story 11. He wasn't on his deathbed, but he was delirious from a UTI. He said that he was a child essayer, that he'd essayed his daughters, and one even got pregnant. Almost everyone in his family disowned him after that. He used to scream it at the visitors of other patients. We contacted a nephew who was the only family member who visited him, and he confirmed it as true. Story 12. I am a nurse, and when I was caring for an old lady, she gave me some questionable advice. She was this 90-something Italian nonna, all dressed in black skirts and dripping with rosary beads and crucifixes, very Catholic. She told me, to be happy in life, you need 3 men. One for the money, one for the love, one for the boom boom. I can't say I agree with her, but it's certainly memorable. Story 13. I am not a nurse, but have been relayed deathbed confessions of my friend's grandfather being a spy for the Chinese government whilst working for Western news agencies in the 70s. They described how there was training in how to take microfilms of documents and hide them from being found during transit, and how to destroy them in case you're caught. But that's about it. Nothing about what was actually taken, or if it led to anything substantial. Story 14. My father told my mother and me that he had stolen my mother's wedding jewelry a couple of years earlier and sold it to invest in stocks he thought were a sure thing. He lost all the money, and everybody in the family blamed my oldest brother because he had a bad gambling addiction and he had stolen from everyone multiple times before. We never told anyone about this. Even 11 years later, everyone still thinks it was my brother. Story 15. I had this old man where I used to work who would never talk unless his daughter was in the room, and she asked something about her stepmother, who passed away a couple of years before I started working there, and her death was the reason he had to come to the nursing home. One of the days after she left, I was getting him ready for bed, and the last thing he said before passing was, "I should have finished the job of drowning her and burning down the house." Both the wife and the daughter, by the way. He immediately passed away after that. Story 16. I was a nurse in training when this happened. One Sunday, the whole family was with my grandparents, my grandpa with Alzheimer's, and we were practicing the piano together. He used to be a pro when he suddenly said, out of nowhere, "I'm going to perish soon, but it's so nice that we gathered here today and can see each other one last time." I just smiled and said I would come back next Sunday, and he doesn't have to worry. When my grandfather had a cerebral hemorrhage the next day and went into a coma, my family wanted me to take care of him at night in the hospital for fear that he would die alone. He was in a coma for 4 days before he could finally leave, but he was never alone. I believe that on that Sunday, he knew for the last time who he really was, who we were, and that his end was coming soon. Story 17. This was my friend, not me, but she told me that one of her patients, hours from death, told her, "The only thing I regret in life is not telling my baby boy, who I found out was 20 at the time, that I accept him." It didn't hit hard until she was told that his son was a transgender male, and it choked her up a lot and even choked me up a bit. Sadly, he checked out before he could tell him a few hours later. The man was roughly 50 and apparently had terminal cancer. Story 18. I had a client, a 90-year-old male, confessed to his wife and children that while he was away on business, he obtained another family. He made it through and went on to live another 2 years. The wife and children kind of cast him out of the family. He thought he was dying immediately of cancer, but he managed to beat it. They were multimillionaires, and he tried to spend as much as he could out of spite, so his children wouldn't inherit any of it. He was a petty old man. Story 19. In 45 years of doing bedside nursing, I have heard a lot because I have worked in the States. In San Antonio, Texas, Tampa, Florida, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as well as Mexico and Honduras, I can tell you that where one lives, the culture has much to do with what people are concerned with in their last hours. Attending a death is a great privilege, especially if the family or the patient requests your presence. I know that my answer will surprise some people. One of the saddest things said is this: I wish my family would go home and get some rest. I know that they mean well. They know that I'm dying, and they believe that I don't want to be alone. But it's hard to imagine taking your last breath surrounded by people, especially people that you love. What I have written just gives you a basic idea of what is said often by my patients. Some say that they actually feel embarrassed. Dying seems like such a private thing, you know. I don't want my family, my wife, my kids to see me as being dead. I don't want them to see me as a corpse. Patients, especially if they themselves have worked in healthcare, that at the time of death there may be an incontinent occurrence of bowel and bladder. Patients are horrified that their loved ones may become aware of this type of occurrence. Patients who are dying have told me since I was a student nurse that they are not alone. There are loved ones in the room with them that are not seen by the rest of us. I don't want to discuss here whether this is a supernatural occurrence or if it is due to brain activity that as yet we don't understand. What is important is that the dying person sees and often interacts with these visitors. They need privacy. If someone who is dying shares with you that they are seeing and hearing long-deceased family members, allow them to speak. Your role in that instance is to be the listener and the affirmer. I am very close to a dear young woman who lost her mother several days before Christmas. Rose and her husband had recently begun their dream job in one of our national parks. Rose's husband was away taking a 3-week course when Rose learned that her recently retired, 65-year-old mother was dying. Rose's mother, Carol, had just remarried, but had been diagnosed with leukemia soon after the marriage. Carol had endured 2 bone marrow transplants. Rose was devastated because her mother did not want her children with her as she was dying. They had all visited with Carol just weeks before. Several days before she passed away, Carol was present with them on FaceTime. The children were very hurt by their mother's reaction. Why were they not wanted? I spent time on the phone and Messenger explaining to Rose that her mother's reaction is not unusual, not at all unusual. There are those people who do want family and friends to be close at their time of passing, but there are certainly those who don't want to have the wake started in the hospital, as I have had patients tell me. With some folks, I can tell you humor is their last sense to go. Most nurses who have been around for a while can tell you about the dying patients who whisper, "Nurse, could you please try to get my family to go home for a while? I don't want to hurt their feelings by telling them." But if you tell them, people need privacy even during the process of dying. And now that I have a venue, may I take this opportunity to remind anyone who will be with a person who is dying to remember not to make the patient's room a site for a family reunion. There are times when the nursing staff can barely get into the patient's room in order to assess their needs. Stagger your visits so everyone is not there at one time, and think about not bringing pungent foodstuffs into the room. The dying person may not be up to the smell of pizza and hot wings. You shake your head and say, "Now, who would do such a thing?" My answer is that many people would do it and have done it. Ask me when was the last time I went into the room of a dying patient only to slip on a chicken. I certainly don't like to come across as the grouchy nurse. There can and should be talk and family interaction in the room of a dying person. People have played musical instruments, which can be uplifting. A beloved pet can be brought into the patient's room. It should all be appropriate, and the patient's dignity must be preserved. It always comes back to the same question, and that is, what would you want when you are dying? Rarely do we hear those unforgettable, famous last words. If the person is able to verbalize, they may express their love. Some families will open a window in the room after the loved one has passed to let her soul fly out to heaven. I have definitely heard regrets about smoking. The regrets have a lot to do with how they perceive the effect that smoking has had on their loved ones. Some will express regret at not having been the best parent. They will more willingly speak to a trusted staff member about tender things than to their family. They don't want to open old wounds now. There isn't enough time. There have been times when I have asked the patient if they would want me to pass anything on to the loved one. One regret that I have never ever heard was the regret at not having worked enough. That's it for me. I hope this answers your question somewhat. At the end of life, it's about dignity. It's about pain control. It's about giving the person who is passing as much control over the environment and care as possible. It is also about keeping the physical body, including the hair, nails, and mouth, as clean as possible. This is to maintain comfort as well as dignity. Lastly, but not least, is to provide spiritual comfort if the patient wishes this support. It must be, of course, as the patient wishes. Story 20. As a nurse, I have seen many patients pass away and have heard lots of last words and sentences from them. Sometimes a patient will say nothing and just pass in silence, and others will say something. In the past, some have said some things which really stuck with me. Some made me stop and think, and others shook me a little. I had a patient called Maggie who was an elderly lady in her 80s. She passed away after having a stroke, her third that year. Just before she passed away, her face lit up and she said, "Hello, Henry." She was so happy, and then she passed. Henry was her husband, who had passed away 10 years before. Another patient, Tom, was 50 years old, and he passed away, terrified. His last words were, "No, please don't let me die." That shook me up and has stayed with me since. And then there was a young female. She had cancer and was only 23, and just before she passed, she looked up, smiled, and said, "Oh, it's beautiful." I've heard many people's final words, and surely will hear many more as I go about my job. Story 21. It isn't so much what he said, but what he did. I was working in a long-term care facility in the 90s. We had a patient named John, who came in with a terminal disease. The staff all loved this man. He was so kind, and his wife of over 60 years attended to his every need. We quickly became close to this family. I wasn't working his hall the evening he expired, but all the nurses were aware he was going to go off our shift and were checking on him and helping his nurse as much as we could. During night med pass, another nurse and I walked into his room, where his nurse was by his bedside. He was obviously taking his last breaths, and his sobbing wife was crying out loud, "John, come back, don't leave me." Time and again, he would visibly pull himself back, trying to stay. His silent lips were forming the word love, as he tried to tell her one more time he loved her. Back and forth, this went for probably only several seconds, but it felt like several minutes. We, nurses, stood there with tears streaming down our faces. One of the few times I have cried in a patient's room. After he passed, his wife sobbed harder than I thought humanly possible, while we tried to get our act together and do all that needed to be done. Thank God it was close to the end of the shift. Professionalism is attending to your other patients without any sign that someone died, let alone that your heart had just torn a little. The next day we realized that each one of us had to pull over at least once on the way home because we were crying too hard to drive. Anytime I think of the power of love, I think of John and his wife. A love so powerful this faithful husband tried desperately to cling to this earth and his sweetheart. The memory is bittersweet and haunts me to this day. Story 22. I've seen many patients pass away, and have been with many of them when they passed. I have heard a lot of last words. Some are meaningful, happy, sad, and then others can be a mumble or gurgle of words that you can really decipher. "Look, look, it's beautiful." This is what a middle-aged man said as he died. He looked very happy and was pointing at the wall. "Hello, Mum?" This is what a 19-year-old woman said. Hello, Mum and Dad are heard quite often if the parents have already died. "Please, no, don't let me die." This is what a woman said as she went into cardiac arrest. And this is the most powerful one, said an elderly man who had been ill for a long time. "Everyone has their time, and it looks like this is my time. Goodbye." And he was gone just like that. Death is an incredible thing, and it comes to all of us in different ways. I often wonder what I'll say, probably something rubbish, knowing me. Story 23. I was taking care of a patient in the neuro ICU once. He had been comatose for quite a while after a CVA and was going to be transferred to long-term care as not likely to awaken. I always talk to my comatose patients as if they can hear me, explaining what's about to happen, what day it is, and the like. I was talking to the guy, explaining the night's plan, and his eyes were tracking me, something he didn't normally do. Comatose people will sometimes open their eyes and stare at something bright, or just straight ahead, but this guy normally did not open his eyes. "Are you listening to me?" He nodded. "Can you speak?" He shook his head. "No." "Give me a thumbs up on the left hand." He did. "Now the right." He did. "That's great. Welcome back. You've been away so long we thought you weren't coming back. I'll go call the doc to come check you out. Issues and zeta percet. Percetu situ." The guy smiled and passed away. Story 24. I worked in palliative care for a few years, and one patient's confession still sticks with me. He was a man in his late 80s, pretty quiet and polite throughout his stay. A few days before he passed, I was helping him get settled for the night when he suddenly said, "I need to tell someone this before I go." He told me that during WWI, when he was just 17, he had lied about his age to enlist while stationed overseas for over a year. He had fallen in love with a local woman. They had a brief but passionate relationship, and she became pregnant. He was shipped out before the baby was born, and due to the chaos of war and not knowing how to get back in touch, he never saw them again. He said he had a family back home and had always kept that part of his life a secret, even from his wife and children. I don't even know if the baby survived. Somewhere out there, I might have another child I never got to know. He said, eyes full of both regret and peace, like he'd finally unloaded a burden he'd been carrying for decades. He passed away 2 nights later. I think about that often. How so many people go through life carrying stories no one ever hears. Story 25. My dad loves small-town auctions, and over the years he collected all those boxes of stuff that would go for the lowest bid. He amassed quite a collection, filling the garage and a workshop out back. He always promised Mom he'd sell it all someday in some big garage sale or auction of his own. Then one day, my mom's cancer returned, and the doctors told us this time it wasn't a fair fight. 2 weeks before she passed, I was sitting with her in the hospital. We'd run out of things to say. She looked up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the pain, and said, "Thank God, at least I won't have to deal with your dad's stuff." My mom and I burst out laughing. Didn't tell Dad about it. Thank goodness for masks, because they helped hide my expression. I so badly wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but no one knew if it was going to be. I said back to him, "I'll do anything you need me to, but right now let's think about some happy memories before you go under." I asked him to tell me about his and his wife's first date. Once he was under, I excused myself before scrubbing in to stop myself from crying. He made it through surgery and his wife was waiting for him after being transferred from the PACU. Story 26. One of the most beautiful moments was for me when I took care of an older lady in her one home. She has always been strong and independent, and never got married or had children. The only family she had was her brother and sister. The lady was very ill because of long-term cancer. She had a lot of conversations with her GP about what she wanted, and if she still had the energy to make it. She has always said to the GP that she wanted to see her brother's and his partner's new house. She was really determined to see their new home. But then there was this day I came to visit her at the start of my evening shift. She was bad. She couldn't get any air anymore. She felt that she was choking. This strong woman was losing her final battle, and that moment she changed. She was scared and wanted it to end. We asked if we should call her brother. At first, she didn't want it, but in the end, she called him to tell him he didn't need to visit her the next day. He didn't need to say any more. My colleague and I stayed with her till midnight and were listening to violin music because she had been a violist. That night she passed away. Story 27. I will never forget a patient who was around 60, whom I met on my oncology rotation. She suffered from a relapse of acute myeloid leukemia after bone marrow transplantation, and also had to fight an uneven battle against a fungal pneumonia. The chances of her surviving were pretty slim, which she knew. The thing is, 1 minute in her presence was enough to make you completely forget about her grim fate. She was cunningly funny in a dirty kind of way, making the most unexpected jokes to the unassuming doctors on the rounds. One day, things looked particularly bad. Her whole family was there in her room and she was sitting on the bed, rather than lying in it, because that way she could breathe more easily and she could also see everyone from her oldest son to the youngest grandchild. I had come into her room to examine her, but she told me I didn't have to. She made one of her dirty jokes, which I have unfortunately forgotten. Everyone laughed, even the ones with tears in their eyes, and I couldn't help but wonder how she was able to think as clearly and talk as normally, despite her severe sepsis. She was talking in complete sentences and refused any morphine. I remember trying to hold back tears, because I somehow knew, as did she. She looked around at her family, then at me, and said, "I am okay." Then she looked at the family again, and lay her head back against the propped-up pillow, finally closing her eyes, as if to sleep. Not 1 minute had passed, and she had passed away. I have never witnessed a patient with such a clear state of mind immediately before dying, and there she was, lying peacefully asleep in the company of those who loved her. She was indeed okay. Story 28. In school, one of the things we were taught was to always, first and foremost, listen to what your patient has to say. Basically, if your patient says that he or she is about to pass out, you better sit them down and be ready to catch them before they fall. On the same token, if your patient tells you, "I feel like I'm going to die," there is a strong chance that they are in fact about to die. The latter has been true for a few patients I've encountered. It usually begins with chest pain/tightness, general malaise, overall just feeling like crap, and/or shortness of breath. Some patients are smart enough to call 911 at this point, fearing a heart attack. Unfortunately, a lot of heart attacks, especially in women, have no symptoms, hence the reason they're known as the silent killer in women, and sometimes men. By the time we arrive on scene, depending on the severity of the coronary blockage and the resulting cardiac tissue death infarction, the call can go one of a few different ways. Now, back to what I said at first. If the patient in this scenario states, "I feel like I'm going to die," they're probably about to die. Their heart is no longer supplying enough oxygen to the body and brain, and the patient knows something is very wrong. One instance I will never forget occurred in the living room of an early 40s male. His kids called 911 after he told them he thought he might be having a heart attack. By the time we arrived, his wife was pulling in the driveway. I made contact with him and immediately noticed how pale and sweaty he was, which were both big indicators of a heart attack. After obtaining his name, and while assessing vitals, I asked him the same question I ask every patient: "What led you to call 911 today?" It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. In a calm and quiet voice, almost like we were friends, he said, "Please get my family out of here. They can watch this. I'm going to die." That statement gave me a jolt of adrenaline and a lump in my throat, and thinking about it today still gives me chills. We immediately called for emergent backup, and I pulled everything out of the truck necessary for a cardiac arrest while my partner administered aspirin and nitro. Thank God we did. A few minutes after his statement, as I finished setting up his 12-lead EKG and my partner obtained IV access, his eyes rolled back, pupils dilated, and I heard a long exhale. I looked at our life pack monitor and confirmed he was in cardiac arrest with a pulseless, lethal heart rhythm called ventricular fibrillation, VFib. We have a really cool tool called the Lucas. Secured correctly, it does virtually perfect chest compressions on the cardiac arrest patient. I began rescue breaths while my partner set the Lucas up. With this machine, we can still maintain perfusion or blood circulation via CPR while transporting the patient on the backboard and stretcher to the ambulance. Backup arrived, and we bolted to the hospital with 4 EMTs and medics in the back and a fireman driving. 10 or so rounds of CPR later, as we were walking into the ER, our patient had converted to ventricular tachycardia VTAC with a pulse, a drastic improvement. We transferred care to the nurse admitting the patient, while a team of healthcare workers cardioverted him into our normal, everyday healthy heart rhythm, dubbed sinus rhythm. Our patient had had a massive heart attack, called an ST elevation myocardial infarction, STEMI. To this day, I believe he would not have made it, had he not told us he was going to die. That warning allowed us to have everything ready to begin CPR as soon as he coded. I still tell this story to colleagues and orientees today. It is our job as healthcare workers to be advocates for our patients, and our single greatest tool to do so is listening to what they have to say. Story 29. I was in hospice, caring for an older woman who seemed to be really suffering. I was struck by how often she called for pain medicine. What we give there isn't the weak stuff. I'm narcotic naive, meaning no built-up tolerance to narcotics, and I thought to myself, wow, if I took this much in the course of my shift, I don't know if I'd be breathing by the end of it. The fourth time she was my patient for the night, I was taking in another dose of morphine, and out of nowhere I was impulsively struck to ask her a question. "Have you forgiven everyone?" That sprang out before I could even consider it. She stopped everything. In the silence that fell on us, she looked me square in the eye, and with a drawn-out reply coupled with a slow back and forth of her head, she said, "Oh, that's hard." I stayed in her room a lot that night. She related a long, complex story about the grief and torment her ex-son-in-law had delivered to their family and her in particular. He had been out of her life picture for better than a decade and a half, but the bitterness was well and deeply rooted. She got out all the details. She said, "I can never forgive him." We had a long talk about forgiveness, what it is, what it's not, and why it was so very, very important. I was back a couple of days later and noticed she hadn't asked for any pain medicine. As soon as I could, I stopped by her room, walked in, and said, "You forgave that man, didn't you?" She replied, "Yes, yes, I did." That shift, she slept so well and looked so peaceful and 18 tons lighter. I was so happy for her. I was off for the next few days. When I got back, she wasn't there. A round of forgiveness was bought for the whole house. Lightened up, it was time to fly. Story 30. My grandmother was from Spain. At some point in my life, I was like, why don't I know how to speak Spanish? So I asked my mom, as I've never heard her speak Spanish either. She said my mom came to America and was one of the "we are in America now, so we speak English now" people. When we started pestering her to teach us Spanish, she claimed that she forgot how to speak it. We all kind of thought she was full of crap, but she was adamant about it. She was sharp as a tack until her mid-90s and lived alone. Finally, it was too much and we moved her to our house and then to assisted living because she wanted to be closer to her friends. When she ended up in a nursing home because she was on her last legs and her mind started to go, we caught her speaking Spanish to the mostly Hispanic staff. Basically, she had to go senile to forget that she told us that she couldn't speak Spanish. It was an unintentional confession that she always knew how to speak Spanish, but she just didn't want to because it wasn't the American thing to do. Story 31. I walked into my mom's room and she was just sitting in her chair with her head tilted and looking off into the distance. After a minute she looked at me and smiled and said, "Well, that's it then. There's nothing more to do." She wasn't really lucid at the time, so I just carried on with our visit, and when they brought her supper I told her good night. A few hours later, the nurse called me to say that she had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. I held her hand while she passed, but she never said anything more. Story 32. I'm not a nurse, but my grandpa's war buddies have some very funny, strange, and terrifying stories. One gentleman shared this experience. His grandpa was a handyman doing all sorts of odd jobs for money during the Depression. Home repair, horseshoeing, fence repair, just any job he could get. He had a smokehouse he turned into a tool shed to store his growing tool collection. After a job, he came home to find his tool shed open and cleared out, and all of his tools were gone. He eventually discovered that a nearby farmer had one-room shacks he would rent out to passers-by for $1 a month. People are going to the next town, helping to harvest crops for bread, or just needing a place out of the rain. With more questions and inquiries, he narrowed his search to one particular shack. At 2 a.m. on a moonlit night, Grandpa walked through the woods and knocked on the door of that shack. A younger man opened the door, and Grandpa asked him for his help with something. Getting him away from the shack and out into the woods, this is what happened. Pointing a firearm at the young man, he told him to understand that he was going to bite the dust. Nothing he could say or do was going to prevent this. Cry and beg all you want. Now, when he opened the door of the shack, Grandpa saw a young lady with 2 kids asleep in the bed. If the young man were honest and told Grandpa the truth, this would end with him. But if he decided to be a coward and lie, Grandpa would come back. The horrifying part of this story is that, as a 9-year-old kid, I had to hold the flashlight for Grandpa as he walked through the woods. Grandpa was able to recover enough of his stolen items that he didn't return to the shack. But I still remember the sound of that single gunshot. Story 33. Several days after our 50th wedding anniversary, after an extended illness, my husband succumbed to this illness at home comfortably in a regular bed while under hospice supervision. Since they had come from different states for our anniversary, our 5 adult children and our grandchildren, and 2 of his brothers were at home with us for those last days. On that Sunday evening, he and I climbed into the bed together, where I stayed with him until Tuesday, waking every several hours as he did. We talked and interacted. Although he was less comfortable every hour, I had the hospice morphine and oxygen to help him when he needed it. Family members came in and out of the room each day, dozing off and on. He greeted his children and siblings and friends with expressions of love. He smiled, kissed, and talked to the grandchildren when they climbed up on the bed to say "I love you" to him. Looking back, I feel so grateful for the peacefulness of the process. He was very fortunate. Well, on Tuesday evening, I could sense he was moving away. I invited our rabbi to come to our home and say the final prayers with him. We all gathered around the bed for that service. Then I invited each of the 5 offspring and his brothers to have private time with him, and I waited in the other room. That's when it happened. I sensed a clear direction for my next actions. Not a voice speaking to me, nor a vision. I just knew he needed some more space from me to be able to leave. I asked the 2 brothers who were there if they would be willing to sit with him, and they both agreed. I lay down next to him once more and said I was going to go to the shower and read for a while. Carefully, I never said I'd be coming back. I kissed him on the cheek and said, "For 2 bumblebees, we've had a good run," and he replied, "Because of you." Our last words to each other included a loving confirmation of our lives together. About 3 hours later, one brother came and said, "He's slipping away. Do you want to come back in?" I had not thought about that ahead of time. When he asked that, I envisioned the 3 brothers in the other room, unified and interacting inside a cocoon of sorts, safe and peaceful. I remembered the ex that came to me, encouraging me to give my husband more space to leave. And so, no, I replied. He is in good hands with both of you. I don't want to change the rhythm at all. Within 15 minutes, his brother returned to say he had gone on his last journey. I woke up all our family members, so each could have private time with him after his death. Then we waited for the hospice nurse to declare the death and the funeral home to come and take him from the house. He was so fortunate in his passing. When we are born, the only thing we know about our lives is that one day we each will check out. What we do between birth and death is what we have control over every day. He lived long enough to experience a secure marriage and the deep love of his children, grandchildren, siblings, and friends. He lived to see many of his goals become accomplishments. He was certainly a lucky man. Story 34. I once cared for a man who got to the hospital because of his cancer. Because of his cancer, his bones would fail on him, and he was partially paralyzed from the middle down. When he was in the hospital, it became clear he probably had another form of cancer too. He would have to stay longer to do some tests and wait for the results. One time, I walked up to him in his room. He was sad and emotional, so I sat next to him and let him talk. He was done living, he said. He didn't want to be in the hospital. At the end of the conversation, he said, "I wish a train would pass by." 10 minutes after my shift was over, he passed away. It wasn't and still isn't obvious what caused his death. But for all we know, he couldn't get to the train, so the train got him. His wife was sad but relieved. She knew how much he struggled. Such a strong woman. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.